Welcome back. Why did Harris lose the 2024 presidential elections in the US? Well, there's many reasons possibly, but one of them is, I would contend, that she had a decision model that was faulty. It did not reflect reality. Why was it faulty? Well, I'm going to suggest it was faulty for a problem with reasoning that is quite common, which is what I like to call the tyranny of averages. I'll explain in a second. This channel is really about applying the principles of debating to clear thinking. And there's a lot of advantages to clear thinking. One of them is better decision making. And in setting out the ideas or the paradigm of clear thinking, I've in effect created a model for decision making. So when one looks at data points, assumptions, and conclusions, the conclusions are actually the decisions. And if one doesn't have the correct data points or the correct assumptions, one can't come up with the correct conclusions. So the tyranny of averages is a phrase I developed, but it was influenced by this gentleman called Richard Lockridge, who wrote a seminal paper in 1975 in the BCG journal. BCG is Boston Consulting Group. They're a prominent management consulting firm. And his basic premise was that when you have large groupings, the average of those large groupings are not very useful. They don't give useful information from which you can create inferences. For example, inferences about voter intent. And his practice was actually going to company and doing what he called de-averaging. That is, breaking up large groups into much smaller groups and to use that information to create insights into the larger group. I believe that the problem with Harris and the Democrats is that the groupings they used were too large, and therefore the implications for voter intent were wrong. So let's look at some of these groupings. They used a lot. They used gender. They used other variables, but one of them was definitely ethnic groupings. Now, what's a problem with using these ethnic groupings? The problem is they're too large. So take, for example, Hispanics. So there's no such thing as a Hispanic. There are Cubans that immigrated from Cuba and Venezuelans, both of which came from countries that were communist. So they have a particular perspective, a particular pro-capitalist perspective that is not necessarily there in other groups that have had different experiences, like Dominicans, for example. So Cuban American or a Venezuelan American or immigrant would not be very keen on policies designed to, quote unquote, punish the rich. They wouldn't be too keen on raising capital gains taxes and creating an asset tax. And one can't assume that they will, irrespective of their income level, because of their experiences. Likewise, Mexican Americans, some of them have been in the US for 400 years in terms of their ancestry, whereas other ones have come in very recently. So the idea that both groups will have the same view on illegal immigration is an assumption that might not hold up if you were to divide the group into smaller groupings. Likewise with Asians. What the heck is an Asian? I don't know what an Asian is. When they talk about anti-Asian crime, is that crime against Asians of South Asian ancestry, people of Indian ancestry? No, it doesn't. So the concept that there's something that is similar in terms of voting intent of an Asian of Indian ancestry and an Asian of Chinese ancestry is not necessarily true. These groups have different cultures, different experiences, different histories, and to amalgamate them based on their ethnicity doesn't necessarily make sense. You can apply the same thing with blacks. What exactly is a black? African Americans, their ancestors have been here for 400 years. New immigrants that are black from Africa, or new immigrants that are black from the Caribbean. These groupings have very different experiences. They have very different social and cultural values, and it's hard to amalgamate them. Likewise with whites. There are rich whites. There are whites in the Appalachian Mountains who often are very poor. In terms of education and culture, you could segregate each of these ethnic groups and divide them according to education and culture within blacks, within whites, within Asians. And you'd find, quite possibly, that there's a commonality amongst the ethnic groups, that a person in the top quintile of education and income in the black community has more in common with a person in the top quintile in the South Asian community in terms of education and culture, rather than having the same correlation in that ethnic group with the bottom 80% of education and culture. And so it's quite possible that segmenting these ethnic groups further leads to a much better outcome. So that's my theory, that because the groupings were so large, the inferences about voter intent were wrong. And that in your life, you can apply this principle by really questioning whether the conceptual categories you have are too broad and whether you can deconstruct it and de-average it down to make better decisions. I mean, one concrete example is real estate. On average, real estate has never gone down in the US if you aggregate all markets. But you don't buy a house in the US, you buy it on a street, in a city, in a state. And if you were to buy a house in the 1950s in Detroit, you really haven't done that well, which defies the average. And so that's an example of how you can apply this sensitivity to de-averaging in your own analysis. So what do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments.